The dawn of January 15, 1876, fell over Vicksburg like a heavy blanket. The Mississippi winds carried the weight of a century of pain that seemed to never end. In the slave quarters of Rosewood Plantation, only the creaking of old wood and whispered prayers in forgotten languages broke the silence. In this deadly quiet, Ezekiel Thompson, 28 years old, opened his eyes for the last time as a man who still believed in white man's justice. Ezekiel was different from the others. Tall with broad shoulders, shaped by years of carrying burdens that weren't his own, his rough hands told stories his mouth never dared to speak. Born free in the North, he had come to Mississippi in 1874, chasing the promise of paid work in post-war reconstruction. What he found was a freedom that existed only on paper, a renewed slavery disguised as work contracts, and Jim Crow laws that turned rights into negotiable privileges. Rosewood Plantation stretched across 2,400 acres of fertile land along the Mississippi River, 15 miles from Vicksburg. It was a cotton empire ruled by Major Conrad Whitfield as its absolute master. Even 11 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, Whitfield ran his property as if freedom was just a temporary inconvenience, a paper signed in Washington by men who had never smelled the earth worked by black hands. Before we dive into one of the most powerful and unknown stories in American history, I need you to do one thing. If you believe that stories like this need to be told, that forgotten voices deserve to be heard, click the subscribe button right now. And if this story moves you, and believe me it will, click the like button and comment on where you're watching this video. Help us reach more people who need to hear the truth about our past. Vicksburg carried its own scars. The city that had resisted Grant's 47-day siege in 1863, where citizens hid in caves while cannons destroyed their streets, still hadn't fully recovered from the war's trauma. The defeat left a bitterness that fermented in taverns, churches, and whispered conversations between white men who felt betrayed by fate itself. In the quarters, the old slave cabins that now housed free workers, lived 847 men, women, and children, trapped in sharecropping contracts that continued servitude under a new name. Ezekiel watched everything with eyes that had known true freedom. He saw how Samuel Peterson, the head overseer, distributed weekly rations with the same calculated cruelty as always. He saw how Martha Williams, 16 years old, lowered her eyes when overseer Jake Morrison passed her cabin. He saw how little Thomas, only 8 years old, already carried cotton sacks on his thin shoulders that weighed more than he did. Peterson, Morrison, Davies, and Campbell, the 4 overseers who ruled the quarters with iron fists and whips always ready. 400 years of oppression concentrated in 4 men who woke up each morning to continue a system that turned human beings into property, freedom into privilege, dignity into merchandise. Samuel Peterson was the oldest at 52, a man of refined hatred, a Civil War veteran who had fought for the Confederates in the defense of Vicksburg itself in 1863. He saw the defeat as a personal humiliation that he took out daily on the black workers. His always polished leather boots echoed through the dirt corridors like judges' hammers, pronouncing sentences that never knew mercy. Peterson had been at Vicksburg when the city finally fell to Union forces. He remembered the hunger, the fear, the sound of artillery shells exploding overhead. But most of all, he remembered the humiliation of surrender. In his twisted mind, every black face was a reminder of that defeat. Every act of defiance a chance to reclaim the authority he felt the war had stolen from him. Jake Morrison, at 34, was pure brutality without disguise. His muscles were developed not by honest work, but by constant practice of violence. His hands, large as shovels, knew only 2 functions: wielding the whip and grabbing what didn't belong to him. Whispers in the quarters spoke of his nightly visits to the cabins of younger women, visits that always ended with silent tears and threats that guaranteed silence. Morrison took particular pleasure in his work. Where Peterson's cruelty was cold and systematic, Morrison's was hot and immediate. He enjoyed the fear in people's eyes, the way they flinched when he approached. He saw terror as respect and confusion as submission. In his simple mind, might made right, and he had plenty of might to spare. Robert Davies was different. His cruelty was intellectual, refined, calculated. A former accountant who had found in supervising work contracts a way to enslave minds beyond bodies. He created impossible debts, manipulated numbers, turned promised wages into eternal obligations. His round glasses reflected ledgers that were true death certificates of hope. Davies understood that physical chains were unnecessary when financial chains were stronger. He could trap a family for generations with a single contract, bury them in debt so deep that their children's children would still be paying. His weapon wasn't the whip, it was the pen, and he wielded it with deadly precision. Marcus Campbell, the youngest at 29, was perhaps the most dangerous. Son of a small farming family ruined by the war, he had directed his bitterness toward those he considered responsible for his own disgrace. In him, racial hatred mixed with class envy, creating a poison that infected every interaction, every order, every look. Campbell had grown up hearing stories of how good things were before the war, when everyone knew their place and stayed in it. The new world confused and angered him. He couldn't accept that black people might have the same rights as whites, couldn't understand why the old order had to change. His anger was the anger of a man who felt the world owed him something and was constantly disappointed. Ezekiel observed, catalogued, memorized everything. His mind, educated in northern schools, recorded every abuse, every humiliation, every cry muffled in the darkness of night. He knew that his own presence there was an anomaly, a literate black man who spoke as an equal and looked people in the eyes without lowering his head. This bothered the overseers more than any open rebellion would have. The education that was supposed to be his freedom had become his curse. He could read the contracts that kept his people enslaved, understand the laws that denied them justice, recognize the patterns of oppression that others accepted as natural order. Knowledge, he learned, could be a heavier burden than ignorance. It was in the third week of December that Ezekiel's world completely shattered. Martha Williams, the young woman with large eyes who reminded him of his sister, who died in the cholera epidemic of 1871, didn't show up for morning work. The women whispered, the men looked away, the children seemed to have forgotten how to smile. They found Martha 3 days later, floating in the muddy waters of the creek that cut through the property. Her body carried marks that told a story of violence that the overseers classified as an accident and Colonel Whitfield as a closed matter. There was no investigation, no justice, not even an official moment of silence for the lost life. But Ezekiel knew, everyone knew. The tears of Mrs. Williams, who lost her daughter and received only institutional silence as consolation, were drops of acid that corroded the last patience of men who had lost everything except the ability to feel pain. That night, for the first time, Ezekiel couldn't sleep. Lying on the straw mattress he shared with 2 other workers, his eyes remained fixed on the wooden ceiling where moonlight filtered through cracks, creating patterns that looked like prison bars. The smell of sweat, fear, and desperation that filled the quarter's air now mixed with something new, something that took him hours to identify, the metallic scent of revenge taking root. The weeks that followed brought a particularly cruel winter to Mississippi. Temperatures dropped beyond usual, and the quarters, poorly heated and overcrowded, became incubators of disease and discontent. The overseers, irritated by the cold that also affected them, doubled their brutality as a way to warm their own sour spirits. It was in this context that Ezekiel began to notice patterns. Peterson always made his last round at 2:30 in the morning. Morrison drank himself senseless every Thursday, celebrating what he called middle of the work week. Davies worked alone in the office until the early hours of morning, reviewing contracts and calculating ways to expand workers' debts. And Campbell had the lightest sleep of all, but also the most predictable habit. Every new moon night, he secretly visited the widow Henderson in town, always returning before dawn. Ezekiel didn't plan what would happen next. Justice, when it finally emerges from oppression's shadows, rarely follows pre-written scripts. It's born from the meeting of accumulated pain, present opportunity, and momentary courage, a volatile chemistry that can explode at the most unexpected moment. The new moon of January 14th, 1876, brought with it an absolute darkness that seemed to swallow even the stars. In the quarters, the silence was different, no longer the silence of resignation, but something denser, charged with electricity that precedes storms. Ezekiel rose at 2:15 in the morning, not by planning, not by conscious decision, but because something in his chest, perhaps Martha Williams's very soul, wouldn't let him rest. He put on his simple clothes, pulled on his worn boots, and walked outside. The cold cut like a blade, but he barely felt it. His steps on the ground, hardened by ice, were muffled, almost ghostly. In the distance, he could see the dim light in the office window where Davies worked, calculating future miseries. Further ahead, Peterson's cabin remained silent. The head overseer slept the sleep of those whose conscience had been cauterized by the habit of cruelty. There was no plan. There was no conspiracy. There was only a man walking in the darkness of a winter dawn, carrying on his shoulders the weight of every injustice he had witnessed, every tear he couldn't dry, every scream he couldn't silence. When he reached the tool shed, his hands already knew what to look for. The axe used for cutting firewood weighed 3 pounds of forged steel and oak handle. In Ezekiel's calloused hands, it became something more than a tool. It became an instrument of justice that white courts would never grant. The story about to unfold in the coming hours would forever change not only the lives of Rosewood's inhabitants, but would echo through the years as a cry of freedom that not all Jim Crow laws could silence. Join us on this journey through one of the most transformative nights in the untold history of the southern United States. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your likes. The weight of the axe in Ezekiel's hands felt familiar, almost comforting. It reminded him of his childhood in Pennsylvania, where his father, Isaiah Thompson, had taught him to split wood for their small cabin near Philadelphia. Isaiah had been born into slavery in Virginia, but escaped through the Underground Railroad in 1842, 4 years before Ezekiel's birth. The old man's hands, scarred by chains and whips, had trembled the first time he held his newborn son, a child born free, something Isaiah had never dared to dream possible. "Boy," Isaiah would say, while they worked together in their small vegetable garden, "freedom ain't something they give you. It's something you take and hold on to with both hands." These words echoed in Ezekiel's mind as he stood in the tool shed, the cold Mississippi air burning his lungs. His father had died in 1873, never knowing that his son would one day find himself in a place that made Virginia's plantations look merciful by comparison. Ezekiel's education had begun in the basement of Mother Bethel AME Church, where escaped slaves and freedmen gathered secretly to learn reading and writing. By age 12, he was teaching younger children their letters. By 16, he had read every book he could find: the Bible, Frederick Douglass's autobiography, copies of The Liberator that arrived from Boston months late, but still burning with righteous anger. His mother, Sarah, had worked as a seamstress for wealthy Philadelphia families, her needle creating beautiful dresses for white women, while her own clothes remained patched and simple. She saved every penny she could, dreaming of the day her son might attend a real school, maybe even university. "Education is the ladder out of this hole," she would tell him while mending clothes by candlelight. "Don't you ever stop climbing." When Sarah died of tuberculosis in the winter of 1872, Ezekiel felt the world shift beneath his feet. The small inheritance she left, $37 and her sewing kit, felt like both a blessing and a burden. Without family ties holding him north, the promises of work and opportunity in the reconstructed South began to seem possible, even necessary. The journey south had been Ezekiel's first real taste of how different freedom could look depending on where you stood. In Pennsylvania, he had been Ezekiel Thompson, educated man, respected member of his community. The moment he crossed into Maryland, he became just another black face in a land where black faces were automatically suspect. By the time he reached Mississippi in the late summer of 1874, Ezekiel understood that Reconstruction was failing before it had truly begun. The promises of 40 acres and a mule had dissolved into sharecropping contracts written in language designed to confuse and entrap. The freedoms guaranteed by the 14th and 15th Amendments existed only in Washington's imagination, not in Mississippi's reality. Rosewood Plantation had seemed like an opportunity when Major Whitfield's advertisement appeared in the Vicksburg Herald, seeking educated Negro to manage plantation records and worker contracts. Fair wages for honest work. What Ezekiel found was a system more sophisticated than slavery, but no less cruel. The major needed someone who could read and write to help maintain the illusion of legality around contracts that were designed to never be fulfilled. Within weeks, Ezekiel realized he had become complicit in the very system he thought he was escaping. His job was to read contracts to workers who couldn't read themselves, explaining terms that sounded fair, but were loaded with hidden clauses and impossible conditions. He watched families sign away their freedom with an X marked beside their names, trusting him to tell them the truth when truth itself had become a luxury he couldn't afford. Samuel Peterson had taken an immediate dislike to Ezekiel's presence on the plantation. The head overseer saw education in a black man as an insult to the natural order, a violation of everything he believed about racial hierarchy. Peterson had grown up on a plantation in Alabama, where the division between black and white was absolute and unquestionable. The war had destroyed his world, but he was determined to rebuild it one whip crack at a time. Peterson's military service had hardened whatever capacity for mercy he might once have possessed. At the Battle of Champion Hill, just 20 miles from where they now stood, he had watched Union soldiers, many of them black, overrun Confederate positions with what he considered savage efficiency. The sight of armed black men in Union blue had burned itself into his memory like a brand. Every day since, he had worked to remind black people of what he saw as their proper place in the world. The overseer's cruelty wasn't random or emotional. It was systematic, calculated, purposeful. He understood that breaking spirits was more important than breaking bodies. A broken body might heal, but a broken spirit passed its damage to the next generation. Peterson's real genius lay in his ability to make oppression feel natural, inevitable, even deserved. Jake Morrison's brutality was different, simpler and more direct. Where Peterson was a surgeon of suffering, Morrison was a butcher. He had grown up poor white trash in the Mississippi Delta, raised by a father who drank away the family's cotton farm and a mother who died giving birth to her 8th child. Morrison learned early that strength was the only currency that mattered, and he had been collecting it with interest ever since. Morrison's relationship with the female workers on the plantation was an open secret that everyone was forced to ignore. Major Whitfield knew, Peterson knew, the workers certainly knew, but knowledge without power meant nothing. Morrison took what he wanted when he wanted it, secure in the understanding that no court would ever believe a black woman's word against a white man's denial. Martha Williams had been Morrison's latest target. The girl's beauty was undeniable. Smooth, dark skin, intelligent eyes, a spirit that refused to be completely broken despite everything she had endured. Morrison had been circling her for months, making increasingly bold advances, confident that eventually her resistance would crumble under the weight of inevitability. Martha's mother, Ruth Williams, had tried to protect her daughter the only way she knew how, by keeping her close, never letting her work alone in the fields, always ensuring she was surrounded by other women who could serve as witnesses if needed. But protection was limited when the predator wore the badge of authority and had the law on his side. Robert Davies represented a different kind of evil, the banality of oppression wrapped in the respectability of numbers and contracts. His small office in the plantation's main house was filled with ledgers that recorded not just financial transactions, but human lives reduced to profit margins and debt calculations. Davies saw himself as simply a businessman, applying sound financial principles to agricultural management. The fact that his sound principles resulted in human suffering was, to his mind, regrettable but necessary. Davies had studied accounting at the University of Mississippi before the war interrupted his education. He returned to find a world where the old certainties had been swept away, replaced by chaos and confusion. The mathematical precision of accounting offered him a refuge from uncertainty. Numbers didn't lie, didn't argue, didn't question the moral implications of their arrangement. His genius lay in creating debt that reproduced itself. A family might borrow money for seed in the spring, work all summer in the blazing heat, and find at harvest time that they owed more than when they started. Interest, storage fees, equipment rental, housing costs, food advances. Davies could make money appear and disappear with the stroke of a pen, always ensuring that the plantation's workers remained exactly where he needed them, desperate enough to work, but never free enough to leave. Marcus Campbell's hatred was more personal than the others, rooted in a sense of displacement and loss that he could never quite articulate. His family had been small farmers before the war, owning a modest 160 acres in northern Mississippi. They had been the kind of people who looked down on both the wealthy planters and the slaves, too proud to be servants, too poor to be masters. The war had destroyed everything Campbell's family had built over 3 generations. Union troops had burned their house, slaughtered their livestock, and left them with nothing but ashes and anger. Campbell's father had died of a heart attack in 1867. Sitting on the porch of the sharecropper's cabin, they had been forced to rent on land they once owned. His mother had followed a year later, worn down by poverty and heartbreak. Campbell blamed black people for his family's destruction, reasoning that if they had remained content with slavery, there would have been no war, no devastation, no loss. In his twisted logic, every black face was a reminder of what he had been robbed of. Every sign of black advancement was a personal insult that demanded correction. Working as an overseer gave Campbell the authority he craved and the opportunity to inflict on others the suffering he felt had been unfairly inflicted on him. He saw every punishment he administered as a small payment on a debt that could never be fully settled, every act of cruelty as justified revenge for the life he should have lived, but never would. The 4 overseers formed a perfect storm of oppression, each bringing his own particular brand of cruelty to bear on the workers under their control. Peterson provided the systematic brutality, Morrison the physical violence, Davies the economic entrapment, and Campbell the personal venom. Together, they created an environment where hope itself became a form of rebellion. Ezekiel had watched this system operate for 18 months, documenting its mechanisms in his mind while playing his assigned role in its continuation. He had seen strong men reduced to shadows of themselves, watched children grow old before their time, witnessed the slow assassination of dreams that should have been protected by law but were destroyed by custom. The breaking point had been building for weeks before Martha's death. A series of small cruelties and large injustices had accumulated like pressure in a steam engine, each incident adding heat and force to what was becoming an inevitable explosion. A child beaten for spilling milk, a woman whipped for looking directly at Peterson, an old man forced to work with a fever until he collapsed and died in the cotton field. But Martha's death was different. It wasn't the result of calculated cruelty or systematic oppression. It was the product of pure evil, the kind of evil that revealed itself in the dark and left its victims floating in muddy water with their stories untold and their justice undelivered. Ezekiel had found her body himself, walking along the creek in the early morning hours when he couldn't sleep. The sight would be burned into his memory forever. Her young face peaceful in death, her body telling a story of violence that made his stomach turn and his hands shake with rage. He had run back to the quarters, shouting for help, knowing even as he did that help would not come in the form he needed. Ruth Williams's screams when she saw her daughter's body had torn through the morning silence like a blade, a sound of grief so pure and terrible that it seemed to crack the sky itself. The official investigation had lasted exactly 4 hours. Sheriff Thomas Bradshaw, a man who owed his position to Major Whitfield's political influence, had examined the body, spoken briefly with Morrison and Campbell, and declared the death an accidental drowning. Case closed, matter settled, life moved on. But life didn't move on for everyone. Ruth Williams aged 10 years in the days following her daughter's funeral. The other women in the quarters moved through their work like ghosts, jumping at shadows and speaking in whispers. The men worked with their heads down and their fists clenched, knowing that justice was a luxury they couldn't afford, but craving it nonetheless. Ezekiel felt something die inside him during those days after Martha's death. Not hope exactly, but the illusion that hope could exist within the system as it stood. He realized that all his education, all his careful documentation of injustice, all his faith in the eventual triumph of right over wrong meant nothing in a world where a 16-year-old girl could be murdered and her killer could return to work the next day as if nothing had happened. Standing in the tool shed with the axe in his hands, Ezekiel felt the weight of every story he had been forced to witness, every cry for help he had been powerless to answer, every injustice he had been required to record, but never to challenge. The tool in his hands was no longer just an axe. It was the concentrated will of every person who had ever been denied justice, every dream that had ever been murdered, every hope that had ever been strangled in its cradle. The night was dark, but Ezekiel's purpose was crystal clear. Justice was coming to Rosewood Plantation, carried in the hands of a man who had finally stopped believing that others would deliver what he could provide himself. The darkness that surrounded Ezekiel was about to give birth to a reckoning that would echo across Mississippi and beyond. The axe felt heavier with each step Ezekiel took away from the tool shed. The weight wasn't physical, 3 pounds of steel and oak handle, but moral, spiritual, final. Every footfall on the frozen ground marked another step away from the man he had been and toward the man he was about to become. There would be no going back after tonight. He understood this with the clarity that comes only in moments when everything that matters hangs in the balance. The plantation lay before him like a map of oppression made real. The quarters stretched to his left, filled with 847 souls trapped between freedom and slavery. The main house rose to his right, white columns gleaming in the starlight like the bones of some ancient beast. Between them lay the overseer's cabins, 4 small structures that housed 4 men whose deaths would change everything. Ezekiel's first stop was Samuel Peterson's cabin. The head overseer lived alone, his wife having died of consumption 3 years earlier. Peterson claimed she died of a broken heart over the South's defeat, but everyone knew the truth. She had died of shame, unable to live with what her husband had become in the years following Appomattox. The cabin stood dark and silent, smoke rising from the chimney into the frozen air. Peterson would be sleeping deeply, secure in his authority, and confident in his safety. In his mind, he was the rightful master of all he surveyed, protected by law and custom from any real threat. Black people were children in Peterson's worldview, capable of mischief but never true rebellion. Ezekiel approached the front door with the silence of a man who had learned to move carefully through a dangerous world. The door was unlocked. Who would dare threaten a white overseer in the heart of Mississippi? The hinges creaked softly as he pushed it open, the sound barely audible above Peterson's steady snoring from the bedroom. The inside of the cabin reflected Peterson's rigid personality. Everything was neat, orderly, arranged with military precision. His Confederate uniform hung in a place of honor beside the door, cleaned and pressed as if ready for inspection. On the table, his ledger lay open to the page where he recorded daily punishments, names, offenses, penalties administered with brutal efficiency. Peterson's bedroom door stood ajar. Through the gap, Ezekiel could see the overseer's sleeping form, one arm thrown across his face, the other dangling toward the floor. Even in sleep, Peterson's face wore an expression of cruel satisfaction, as if his dreams were filled with the sounds of suffering he had orchestrated during his waking hours. Ezekiel raised the axe above his head. For a moment, he hesitated. This was murder, cold and calculated. Once he brought the blade down, he would become everything the law said he was: a dangerous black man who couldn't be trusted, a savage who had reverted to his true nature. But then he remembered Martha Williams floating in the creek, and hesitation died. The axe fell with deadly precision. Peterson's eyes opened just as the blade reached him, confusion and terror flashing across his features in the instant before the steel bit deep into his skull. His body jerked once, convulsed, and went still. Blood spread across the pillow, dark and thick in the moonlight filtering through the window. Ezekiel stood over the body for a long moment, expecting to feel something. Remorse, satisfaction, fear. Instead, he felt only a strange emptiness, as if he had completed a task that needed completing. 1 down, 3 to go. Jake Morrison's cabin was a quarter-mile away, closer to the quarters where he could keep watch over the women he considered his property. The brutish overseer lived in squalor that reflected his inner nature. Empty whiskey bottles littered the yard, and the smell of unwashed clothes and spoiled food hung heavy in the air. Unlike Peterson, Morrison was awake when Ezekiel arrived. The overseer sat at his kitchen table, drinking directly from a bottle of corn whiskey and cleaning his pistol, a Colt Navy revolver that he wore like a badge of office. Morrison looked up when the door opened, squinting through alcohol-glazed eyes at the figure silhouetted against the night. "Who the hell?" Morrison began, then stopped when he recognized Ezekiel. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Well, look what we got here. The educated boy, come to pay a visit. You looking for trouble, boy?" "No," Ezekiel said quietly, stepping into the light. "I'm looking for justice." Morrison's laughter was harsh and grating. "Justice? From you? You forget your place, boy. You forget what happens to uppity—" The axe took him in the chest before he could finish the sentence. Morrison's eyes went wide with shock and pain as the blade bit deep between his ribs, finding his heart with surgical precision. He tried to raise the pistol, but his strength was already flowing out with his blood. The gun clattered to the floor as Morrison pitched forward, landing face first on his own table. Ezekiel pulled the axe free, blood spattering the wall behind him. Morrison twitched once, twice, then lay still. The smell of death mingled with the stench of whiskey and unwashed flesh, creating an atmosphere of decay that seemed appropriate for the man who had brought so much rot into the world. 2 down, 2 to go. Robert Davies proved more challenging. The accountant worked late in his office in the main house basement, surrounded by ledgers and contracts that kept hundreds of people in economic bondage. Davies was methodical in everything he did, including his personal security. He kept a shotgun beside his desk and a small derringer in his vest pocket. Ezekiel approached the main house with greater caution. Major Whitfield was away in Jackson on business, but the house staff might be awake. He used the servants' entrance, moving through the kitchen and pantry with the knowledge gained from 18 months of coming and going on plantation business. The basement office was well lit, oil lamps burning brightly to allow Davies to work through the night. The accountant looked up when Ezekiel appeared at the bottom of the stairs, his round spectacles reflecting the lamplight like the eyes of some pale, nocturnal creature. "Ezekiel," Davies said calmly, as if midnight visits from armed black men were perfectly normal. "Working late tonight?" "Something like that," Ezekiel replied, stepping into the circle of light cast by the lamps. Davies's hand moved slowly toward the shotgun leaning against his desk. "I suppose you've heard about the unfortunate accident with the Williams girl. Tragic, really. But accidents happen. The important thing is to learn from them and move forward. She didn't die by accident. Oh, and I suppose you have evidence to support that claim? Davies's fingers brushed the shotgun's stock. Because without evidence, it's just one person's word against another's. And we both know whose word carries more weight in Mississippi. Evidence? Ezekiel said, raising the blood-stained axe. I've got all the evidence I need right here. Davies grabbed for the shotgun, but age and soft living had made him slow. Ezekiel was faster, driven by righteous fury and desperate purpose. The axe blade caught Davies across the side of the neck, opening his throat in a spray of red that painted the account books with the color of justice. The accountant clutched at his wound, trying to speak, but only blood came out. He fell backward in his chair, papers fluttering around him like snow, each page representing lives destroyed and futures stolen. Davies died surrounded by the instruments of his own cruelty, the ledgers that had trapped so many people in economic slavery, now soaked with their creator's blood. 3 down, 1 to go. Marcus Campbell was the hardest to find. True to his pattern, he had slipped away to visit the widow Henderson in Vicksburg. Ezekiel waited in Campbell's cabin, sitting patiently in the darkness, while the clock on the mantel ticked away the minutes until dawn. Campbell returned just before 4 a.m., humming tunelessly under his breath and reeking of cheap perfume and cheaper whiskey. He fumbled with the door latch, cursing softly when it stuck. When he finally got inside, he never saw Ezekiel waiting in the shadows beside the fireplace. "Rough night, Campbell?" Ezekiel asked quietly. Campbell spun around, his hand going instinctively to the knife he wore on his belt. When he saw who had spoken, his face twisted with rage and disgust. "You got some nerve, boy. Breaking into a white man's house. You looking to get yourself lynched?" "Maybe," Ezekiel said, standing slowly, "but not before I finish what I started." Campbell saw the axe then, saw the blood that stained its blade and handle. His eyes went wide as understanding dawned. "Jesus Christ, what have you done? What needed doing?" Campbell drew his knife, a long-bladed weapon he had carried since the war. He was younger than the others, faster, more desperate. He lunged at Ezekiel with the skill of a man who had killed before and expected to kill again. The fight was brief but vicious. Campbell was strong and determined, but Ezekiel had the longer reach and the heavier weapon. The knife sliced across Ezekiel's left shoulder, drawing blood and a grunt of pain, but the axe answered with devastating force. The blade caught Campbell in the ribs, cracking bone and tearing through muscle. Campbell staggered, coughing blood, but kept fighting. He grabbed Ezekiel's throat with his free hand, trying to crush his windpipe while bringing the knife around for a killing thrust. Ezekiel twisted away from the blade and brought the axe handle up under Campbell's chin. The overseer's head snapped back, and Ezekiel followed with the blade, taking him across the chest in a spray of blood that painted the cabin walls. Campbell fell backward, crashing into his kitchen table and sending plates and cups flying. He tried to rise, tried to lift his knife one more time, but his strength was gone. He looked up at Ezekiel with eyes full of hatred and disbelief. "You're gonna hang for this," he whispered. "They're gonna hunt you down like the animal you are." "Maybe," Ezekiel said, standing over the dying man, "but you won't be there to see it." Campbell died with a curse on his lips and blood on his hands, the last of the 4 men who had made life hell for everyone in their power. The cabin fell silent, except for the sound of Ezekiel's heavy breathing and the tick of the mantel clock. 4 down. Justice served. Ezekiel walked out of Campbell's cabin as the first light of dawn began to touch the eastern sky. His clothes were soaked with blood, some his own, most belonging to others. The axe hung heavy in his hand, its blade dulled by bone and cartilage, but its purpose fulfilled. Behind him lay 4 dead men who would never again raise a whip against the defenseless, never again steal the wages of the desperate, never again destroy young women for their own twisted pleasure. The system they had served and protected would continue, but it would continue without them. Ezekiel knew what came next. By full daylight, the bodies would be discovered. The sheriff would be summoned. The dogs would be brought out. The hunt would begin. A black man who killed 4 white men in Mississippi in 1876 could expect no mercy from human law. But as he walked back toward the quarters where people were beginning to stir with the approaching dawn, Ezekiel felt something he hadn't experienced since arriving in Mississippi: peace. He had done what needed doing. Martha Williams had been avenged, her murderer and his companions called to account for their crimes. The sun rose blood-red over Rosewood Plantation, painting the sky the color of justice finally served. The discovery came at 6:30 a.m. when Samuel Peterson failed to appear for morning roll call. For 18 years, The head overseer had been as punctual as sunrise itself, arriving at the quarters precisely at dawn to assign the day's work details. When Peterson's familiar silhouette didn't appear on the horizon, the plantation's routine stumbled like a clock with broken gears. Mary Johnson, the cook who prepared meals for the overseers, found Peterson's body first. Her scream cut through the morning air like a knife, sending birds exploding from nearby trees and bringing workers running from all directions. The sight that greeted them in Peterson's bedroom would be burned into their memories forever. The brutal efficiency of the killing, the blood that had soaked into every surface, the look of surprise frozen on the dead man's face. Word spread through Rosewood Plantation faster than wildfire. Within minutes, someone had discovered Morrison's body slumped over his kitchen table. Davies was found in his basement office, surrounded by ledgers stained crimson with his own blood. Campbell's cabin revealed the signs of a struggle: overturned furniture, blood on the walls, and another dead overseer who would never again terrorize the people under his control. Major Conrad Whitfield received the news by telegram while conducting business in Jackson. His response was immediate and predictable. Every law enforcement officer in western Mississippi was summoned to Rosewood Plantation. Sheriff Thomas Bradshaw arrived with a posse of 20 men, their faces grim with the knowledge that 4 white men had been murdered by someone who was almost certainly black. The investigation that followed was everything the inquiry into Martha Williams's death had not been: thorough, determined, relentless. Bradshaw and his men examined every cabin, questioned every worker, searched every hiding place on the plantation. The bloodhounds arrived by noon, their eager baying echoing across the cotton fields as they picked up scent trails and began their deadly hunt. But Ezekiel was not hiding. When the searchers reached his cabin in the quarters, they found him sitting calmly on his doorstep, still wearing the blood-stained clothes from the night's work. The axe lay beside him, its blade clean now but still bearing traces of what it had done. He made no attempt to run, showed no sign of fear or regret. "You Ezekiel Thompson?" Sheriff Bradshaw asked, his hand resting on his pistol grip. "I am." "You kill those 4 men?" "I did." The simplicity of the confession seemed to surprise everyone present. In their experience, guilty men denied, pleaded, bargained, or ran. They didn't sit quietly and admit to quadruple murder as if discussing the weather. "Why?" Bradshaw asked. Ezekiel looked up at the sheriff, his eyes steady and calm. "Because they needed killing." The arrest was swift and efficient. Iron shackles were clamped around Ezekiel's wrists and ankles, and he was loaded into a wagon for transport to the Vicksburg jail. As the wagon rolled away from Rosewood Plantation, hundreds of workers stood watching in silence. Some wept openly, not for the dead overseers, but for the man who had done what they all wished they could do but never dared. The trial was scheduled for February 15th, exactly 1 month after the killings. Judge Cornelius Whitman presided, a man whose reputation for harsh sentences against black defendants was matched only by his leniency toward white criminals. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with white spectators filling every seat, while black observers were forced to stand in the back or wait outside in the February cold. Ezekiel's court-appointed attorney was Thomas Mitchell, a young lawyer fresh from law school who had never handled a capital case. Mitchell was competent but overwhelmed, facing a prosecution team led by District Attorney William Harper, a politician with ambitions for higher office who saw this case as his ticket to fame. The prosecution's case was straightforward and devastating. 4 respected white men had been brutally murdered by a black defendant who had confessed to the crimes. Physical evidence was overwhelming: blood on Ezekiel's clothes, his fingerprints on the murder weapon, eyewitness testimony placing him near each crime scene. Harper painted Ezekiel as a savage who had reverted to his true nature, a dangerous predator who had used his education to plan and execute a reign of terror. Mitchell's defense strategy was limited by the legal realities of 1876 Mississippi. He could not argue self-defense. None of the victims had been attacking Ezekiel at the time of their deaths. He could not claim insanity. His client's confession had been too calm and rational. He could not challenge the evidence. It was too overwhelming to dispute. Instead, Mitchell tried to present context. He called witnesses who testified about the conditions at Rosewood Plantation, about the abuse suffered by workers, about Martha Williams's death, and the lack of any real investigation. He painted a picture of systematic oppression and denied justice, hoping the jury might understand why a man might be driven to such desperate measures. The strategy failed completely. The all-white jury deliberated for exactly 17 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty on all 4 counts of murder in the first degree. Judge Whitman sentenced Ezekiel to death by hanging, the execution scheduled for March 15, 1876. But something unexpected happened during the month between sentencing and execution. Stories about the case began spreading beyond Mississippi, carried by telegraph wires and newspaper reports to other states, where the memory of the Civil War and the promise of Reconstruction still carried weight. In Philadelphia, Ezekiel's childhood church organized prayer vigils and letter-writing campaigns. In Boston, abolitionists who had fought slavery for decades saw his case as a symbol of how little had really changed since emancipation. In Washington, a few Republican congressmen asked uncomfortable questions about justice and law enforcement in the reconstructed South. The pressure was not enough to save Ezekiel's life, but it was enough to make his execution a national story. Reporters arrived in Vicksburg from as far away as New York and Chicago, transforming what should have been a routine hanging into a media spectacle that no one had anticipated. Meanwhile, back at Rosewood Plantation, Major Whitfield struggled to maintain order without his overseers. The replacement supervisors he hired were either too weak to control the workers or too brutal to be effective. Production fell dramatically as workers engaged in slowdowns, accidents, and outright sabotage. Several families simply disappeared in the night, abandoning their contracts and heading north despite the legal consequences. The economic impact spread beyond the plantation itself. Other landowners in the area found their own workers increasingly restless and difficult to control. The story of Ezekiel Thompson, the educated black man who had killed 4 white overseers and shown no remorse, had become a legend that spread through the quarters and fields like gospel truth. On the morning of March 15, 1876, Ezekiel walked to the gallows in the Vicksburg courthouse square with the same calm dignity he had shown throughout his trial. Hundreds of people crowded the square, white spectators expecting to see justice served, black observers witnessing the death of a man who had become a symbol of resistance. The prison chaplain offered last rites, which Ezekiel politely declined. Sheriff Bradshaw asked if he had any final words. Ezekiel looked out at the crowd, his eyes finding the faces of black people who had gathered to witness his end. Martha Williams was 16 years old, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent square. She deserved justice. They all deserve justice. If my death is the price of their peace, I pay it willingly. The trapdoor opened at 12:07 p.m. Ezekiel Thompson died instantly, his neck snapping cleanly from the fall. His body was buried in the black section of Vicksburg Cemetery, the grave marked only with his name and dates. No flowers were permitted, no monument allowed, but that didn't stop people from coming. In the weeks and months that followed, Ezekiel's grave became an unofficial shrine. People would slip into the cemetery at night, leaving small tokens, wildflowers, coins, scraps of paper with prayers written in careful handwriting. The city authorities removed these offerings repeatedly, but they always reappeared. The impact of Ezekiel's actions extended far beyond his own death. Major Whitfield eventually sold Rosewood Plantation, unable to make it profitable without the brutal efficiency of his murdered overseers. The property was broken up into smaller farms, many of which were eventually purchased by black families who had scraped together enough money to escape the sharecropping system. More significantly, the case had exposed the reality of post-Reconstruction Mississippi to a national audience that had largely forgotten about the South's black population. Northern newspapers that had ignored countless stories of abuse and murder suddenly paid attention when the response was as dramatic as Ezekiel's had been. Law enforcement agencies across the South found themselves under increased scrutiny. The cursory investigation into Martha Williams's death, followed by the exhaustive manhunt for her avenger, created an uncomfortable contrast that even sympathetic observers couldn't ignore. While change came slowly and unevenly, the spotlight of national attention made certain kinds of casual brutality more difficult to ignore. Perhaps most importantly, Ezekiel's story became part of the oral tradition that sustained black communities through the darkest years of Jim Crow. Parents told their children about the educated man who had stood up to the overseers, who had chosen justice over safety, who had faced death without fear or apology. The story grew in the telling, becoming a legend that carried hope through generations of oppression. In 1954, when the Supreme Court handed down its decision in Brown v. Board of Education, an elderly black woman in Jackson, Mississippi, was heard to say, "Ezekiel Thompson would be proud to see this day." Most people had no idea who she was talking about, but the name was passed down through families who remembered what one man's courage had meant to their grandparents. The civil rights workers who came to Mississippi in the 1960s found that story still alive in the black communities they served. Young activists who faced police dogs and fire hoses drew strength from the memory of a man who had faced his executioners with dignity intact and purpose fulfilled. Today, Ezekiel Thompson's name appears in no history textbooks. His grave bears no historical marker. His story is told in no museums. The 4 men he killed are equally forgotten, their names lost to time along with the specific details of their crimes. But the impact of that blood-soaked night in January 1876 echoes still in the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. In the end, Ezekiel Thompson's legacy was not the violence he committed, but the dignity with which he accepted its consequences. He understood that some injustices are so profound that they can only be answered with the most extreme measures, and he was willing to pay the ultimate price to deliver that answer. His story reminds us that progress often comes at a terrible cost, paid by individuals whose names history forgets, but whose actions change the world. In a system designed to deny justice to the powerless, sometimes justice must be taken rather than requested, delivered rather than demanded. Martha Williams rests in an unmarked grave beside the creek where her body was found. Ezekiel Thompson lies in Vicksburg Cemetery under a simple stone. The 4 overseers are buried in the white section of the same cemetery, their elaborate monuments slowly crumbling with age and weather. But the story continues. Every time someone stands up to injustice despite the personal cost, every time courage overcomes fear in the face of overwhelming odds, every time the powerless refuse to accept their powerlessness, the spirit of that bloody night in 1876 lives again. Justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes it comes in ways that no court would sanction and no law would permit. Sometimes it comes with an axe in the hands of a man who has seen enough and suffered enough and lost enough to finally say, "No more." Ezekiel Thompson's story ended on a gallows in Vicksburg, but his legacy lives on every time someone chooses courage over comfort, justice over safety. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you why we can't forget our history, then share it. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that like button to help YouTube show this to more people. Subscribe for more untold stories that shaped America.